Sarah was standing behind the door. She couldn't take her hand off the doorknob. The silence from outside had become maddeningly thick. At that moment, she looked at the clock. It was 8 in the morning of the third day. And right in front of his house, he was still there, unmoving, just waiting. A huge lion, its eyes locked on the door of the house. But the most frightening thing was the calmness in his gaze. The first day he saw it, he couldn't believe it was real. He thought he was imagining it. He rubbed his eyes and looked at the glass again and again. But there it was. Its huge, golden mane fluttered gently in the wind, its eyes as still as a stone. A normal animal wouldn't stand like that. A normal lion wouldn't look like that. Sarah had dropped her coffee on the floor that morning. She didn't remember much of what happened after the cup broke. She only remembered watching out from behind the curtains for hours. Reaching for her phone, of course. No, not the police. Animal control? No, 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 no. What was he going to say? There's a lion outside my door, but it doesn't attack me. Would he be taken seriously? But the lion didn't do anything. It didn't even look back at him. It just sat down by the door and raised its head. 1 hour, 2 hours, 5 hours. It was dark. It was night. The lion hadn't moved. Sarah didn't turn on the lights all night. She just looked through the curtains. She couldn't sleep. The second day, it was worse. Because now fear had been replaced by something else. Curiosity. Ridiculous but true. Why was this animal waiting here? Was it not hungry? Thirsty? Could it have been injured? But it looked quite healthy. It looked wild but noble at the same time. His eyes were not predatory. More like observant. Even thoughtful. Sarah even forgot to eat during the second day. She wandered around the house, looking through her old notebooks, flipping through her grandmother's books, but her mind was always at the door. She didn't go outside. But a few times he reached for the door handle. He put his hand on it and then pulled it back. His heart was beating like crazy. That night he dreamed of the lion. But this time he was sitting inside the house. It was too big to fit on the couch, but somehow everything seemed natural. Sarah handed him a cup of coffee. The lion bowed his head, then stared at her, as if he wanted to say something. But no sound came out. When he woke up, he was covered in sweat. And now, the third day, the same position, the same waiting. Sarah was no longer just scared, she was angry. "What do you want from me?" she said. She couldn't find her voice. Maybe she just mumbled, but her eyes filled up. There was a strange feeling of emptiness, as if this lion had made a connection with him, and he didn't understand it. Or maybe he already did, but he wouldn't accept it. Who would live eye to eye with a lion for 3 days? He walked towards the door. The soles of his feet felt cold with every step. It was as if his heart was beating against his ribs. His fingers were cold but trembling slightly. His palms were sweaty. He stopped in front of the door. He closed his eyes for a while. He took a deep breath. Just as he reached for the doorknob, he heard a click. He froze. Was it a lion? No, it sounded like a voice coming from the other side of the door. He listened. Footsteps? Or was it a vision? He heard it again, this time more clearly. The lion had gotten up. He was now right in front of the door. Sarah could now see his shadow behind the thick door. And then the lion put his head under the door. Like a dog. Waiting, not giving up, but with a fragile loyalty. Sarah leaned her head lightly against the door. A strange warmth rose inside her. She was about to cry. Why would a lion make a man cry? There was no threat. It meant nothing. But it was as if a piece of his past had come back and he couldn't remember it. Slowly he crouched down. Light filtered in from under the door. He put his fingers on the floor. Through the gap under the door, he could now hear the sound of a huge, soft but strong breath coming from outside. And one more thing, at that moment his hands trembled, because the lion rubbed its nose lightly under the door. It touched Sarah's fingers, and something inside her snapped. Tears began to flow spontaneously. How many people in this world have cried at the smell, the skin, the breath of an animal they've never met? But at that moment, Sarah was not alone. This animal had come for her. She didn't know why, but she felt it. She picked up her phone. She turned on the camera, but then she turned it off. It felt wrong to record this moment. It was real. He was feeling it. This wasn't for a video. This was the beginning of something. Something he didn't know what it was, but deep in his heart, something he had been waiting for a long time. He stood up without delay. He had made up his mind. He was going to open the door. He slowly reached his hand to the doorknob. The coldness of the metal vibrated on his skin like a spark. He took a deep breath and turned it. The door opened. The dim morning light seeped in. and Sarah took a step. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The lion was there, just outside the door, motionless. But his eyes were no longer looking at her, but into her heart. Deep, golden eyes, with a look that needed no words. Sarah took another step. The lion didn't move. He just narrowed his eyes slightly, as if to say, "You're ready." And then, Sarah dropped to her knees. She held out her hand. The lion bowed his head. He rested his enormous head on her hand. Sarah's fingers tangled in his mane. It was as if a window into the past had opened. Her eyes closed. He took a breath. Deep, full, like the sin of someone who had lost a piece, and suddenly an image flashed in his mind. A forest. Hot, humid air. She's 18 years old. All alone. Crying. And then, a silhouette emerging from the bushes. Those eyes. Those eyes. Those eyes. They were there then. In that moment, Sarah was angry with herself for forgetting all her past. This lion had already been in her life. And now it was back. Why? She would not leave until she found the answer to that question. No matter what. That's when the lion retreated. Without looking back, he started walking towards the garden. Slowly, slowly. It was as if he was awakening a memory with each step. Sarah walked behind him, not wiping away her tears. Her steps were cautious, but no longer driven by fear, but by instinct. And the story was just beginning. When Sarah put her hand on the lion's head, her heart was beating so fast that it felt like it would jump out of her chest and fall to the ground. Her hands were shaking, but this time not from fear. It was a feeling of familiarity. It was the stirring of something from somewhere very deep, very old. It was as if that touch was opening a door he had been waiting for years. Aslan did nothing. He didn't even move. He just narrowed his eyes and leaned his head more and more against Sarah's palms. That golden mane trembled in the sunlight. The warmth coming from its skin gave Sarah a strange peace. At the same time, a nagging curiosity grew inside her. Why was this touch so familiar, this contact? This silent but speaking gaze? At that moment an image appeared in her mind. It was blurry at first. Colors, sounds, dusty air. Then it became clear. A green, dense forest. Thick tree roots. A howling wind. A young girl, almost a child, on her knees, sitting on a muddy path. She was crying. Then something came out of the thicket. A large, silent, watchful shadow. Sarah felt a spark in her mind. This image was real. It was a memory. It wasn't a dream. Once, a long time ago, she had met a lion in a jungle. Her heart raced. His eyes welled up. This can't be, he whispered to himself. It's not possible. But every cell of his body accepted it before his brain did. This lion was a figure from his past. Not an imagination, but a memory. A memory forgotten, repressed, but never erased. Slowly he withdrew. He got up from his knees, but did not take his eyes off her. The lion didn't move either. He just watched her. Silently. With a clear wisdom, Sarah went into the house. Her eyes were still teary. With quick steps she went into the living room. The old bookcase. Dusty albums. She found her childhood favorite box. A blue-colored, slightly worn box with yellowed stickers on it. She opened it. Photographs, notes, old tickets. And then something. An old safari brochure. It said, Tanzania, the Great Wildlife Adventure, 1997. Yes, it is. Exactly as he remembered it. He had gone on vacation with his family that year. They went to Africa with her mom, dad, and brother. It was a childhood dream for him. He saw lions, elephants, giraffes up close for the first time. But for years, he didn't want to remember the moment he got lost during the safari. Now those memories were flooding back. One morning, he slipped out of the guide's sight and plunged deep into the forest. As he ran excitedly with his tiny steps, he lost his bearings. Every direction seemed to be the same. The trees grew denser, the birdsong louder. And then, he was alone. She began to cry in fear. There were no human voices, no familiar tracks. He was as vulnerable as a child in the forest. Just then, he felt something moving behind him. When he turned, he saw it. A big, silent lion. He had come out of the bushes. His eyes, just like today, deep and calm. But at that moment, Sarah didn't run. She froze. Because in the lion's eyes, there was not the hunger of a predator, but the watchfulness of a protector, and the lion had not harmed her. It walked silently beside her, sometimes in front of her. Sarah followed him. She didn't know where she was going, but she felt a strange sense of trust in her heart. Then at some point, she heard a voice. The voice of the guide. her mother crying. And the lion turned back and disappeared into the forest. From that day on, this memory was tucked away in the recesses of his mind. Perhaps when he grew up and became a sensible adult, he dismissed that day as a coincidence. Maybe no one believed him, or even he didn't believe it himself. But now, that memory was real. He was holding it in his hand. The lion whose head she had stroked had those same eyes. As Sarah was flipping through old photographs, a frame caught her attention. A yellowish photo, half blurred. It was from a trip to the forest. Big trees in the background, her family posing in front. But in the left corner, there was a silhouette so small it was almost invisible. He zoomed in. He couldn't believe his eyes. In the semi-shade, behind a rock, only his head was visible. But the mane, the eyes, the position, it was the same lion. He had been watching them even then. Not only that day, but maybe even later, he had followed them from afar. A pain shot through his stomach. His chest tightened. At that moment, he realized this was no coincidence. This lion, it remembered him. It had looked for him. It had found him. He had come back. For something. For a reason. But what? Why now? Why after so many years? And why had he appeared before her again? As these questions flooded his mind, he was startled by a sound outside. Aslan had stood up. He was walking to the other side of the garden. Sarah ran to the window. She watched him. He moved with heavy, noble steps toward the big walnut tree in the corner of the garden. Sarah opened the door. "Wait," she said. The lion stopped. He turned his head slightly. Those eyes again. Like an answer. Sarah left without hesitation. The earth was soft, her feet wet. She followed the lion's tracks. Each step was like a journey into the past. When she stopped at the base of the walnut tree, the lion lay down. He rubbed his nose against the soil. In the same spot, it scratched the earth with its paw several times. Sarah came closer. She noticed something slightly buried in the surface of the soil. She bent down. She held out her hands. It was a box. A small wooden box, rusted at the metal corners, but still intact. He stretched out his shaking hands. He opened the lid. Inside, a handkerchief, worn, lace-edged, and a note. A note that looked like it was written in her own handwriting. But that wasn't possible. There was only one sentence written on it. "I'll wait for you, because when you remember, everything will begin." Sarah sank to the floor, the box in her hand. She gripped the note tightly. Tears welled up in her eyes. The lion stood silently behind her, his eyes staring at the box on the floor. Then Sarah's eyes, then the box again. In that moment, Sarah faced a truth she had been avoiding for years. This animal was not just a savior. It was a bond, perhaps as close as family. A confidant, quiet but watchful, guide, protector. In that box, that writing, it showed that this return was no coincidence, that it had been planned long before. But now there was a new question. What did he say would start it all? Sarah's feet were bare. The coolness of the earth seeped in between her toes, providing a brief respite from the chaos in her mind. As she walked to the back of the garden, the lion was a few paces ahead of her, his steps slow but determined. With each step, it seemed to awaken a story that had been buried in the ground for years. Sarah couldn't describe the feeling, but there was an ache, a stirring, a familiarity. The lion stopped. This was under the big walnut tree. It was where Sarah spent most of her time as a child. On summer days, she would read books in the shade of the tree, sit with her grandfather, and spend hours on the old swing her mother had put in the garden. But today, that tree looked different, more imposing, more silent, as if it had been carrying the burden of decades, and today it would speak. The lion lay down. He put his head on the ground and then gently rubbed his paw on a patch of earth. Sarah approached slowly. She looked carefully. There were some stones on the ground, but they didn't look natural. They looked like they had been put together. They didn't exactly form a shape, but it looked like something was hidden. He reached out his hands. He moved the stones slightly aside. Underneath, buried in the ground, was an old piece of wood. No, a lid. His heart raced. He couldn't believe his eyes. It was a small tank lid. It had almost disappeared under the earth. The lion turned his eyes to Sarah. He had been waiting. He had brought her there on purpose. Sarah knelt down. She scraped the earth with her hands. Dusty, damp earth filled her fingers. She used all her strength to lift the board. It creaked open. A few steps led down beneath it. It was dark, as if it hadn't been opened for years. The smell from inside, the smell of old books and wood and time. Sarah turned her head. The lion was still staring at her. "You," Sarah said in a whisper. "You knew about this. You knew about this place." She walked down the steps, her hand on the edge like a railing. When her feet stepped on the wood, the creaking sound seemed to echo the whole past. When he went down, he found a small, dark room. Stone walls, low roof. Inside, old furniture. A wooden table, a rusty lantern, and in the far corner, a covered chest. He took the lantern. The matchbox was on the chest. He tried to light it. On the second try, light appeared. The place was dimly but warmly lit. There were old photographs on the walls, black and white. His grandfather, young, posed next to a lion. He had his hand on her head, his face strangely serious. Sarah rubbed her eyes. She looked at the photo again. It wasn't like a pet photo. It was like a partnership, an equal bond between two living beings. She opened the trunk. Out came yellow documents, notebooks, maps. A notebook. It was written in his grandfather's handwriting. On the first page was this sentence: "When he comes, I won't be able to tell him everything, but this notebook will be enough for him to understand." Sarah turned the pages. Drawings about lions. I structure, behavioral analysis, notes. And then a page marked in red pen, 1997. The protector is no longer alone. He recognizes the little girl. He is watching her. And when the time comes, he will find her again. Because this bond is forged not just with blood, but with heart. Sarah held her breath. That sentence, it described her. The little girl. Safari. Getting lost. The lion. It was all here. Her grandfather knew that day. And the lion was his grandfather's friend, perhaps his confidant. A delicate necklace fell out of the notebook. The chain was thin, the end decorated with a flat stone. Above the stone was an engraved figure, the head of a lion. Sarah picked up the necklace. It was cold, but as soon as she touched it, a warmth began to spread through her. A connection, like a power from the past, hidden until now. At that moment, a sound came from above. A low growl. Sarah grabbed the lantern and went upstairs. The lion was waiting outside the door. His eyes grew larger, more expressive in the light of the lantern. Sarah showed him the necklace. The lion came closer. He lowered his head, and in the short hairs on his neck, a scar was revealed. A scar on his skin, the same shape as a stone, round, but with a bulge in the center. It looked exactly like the mark of that stone. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands. All the pieces fit together. This lion was her grandfather's protector. Perhaps a presence that had been with her family for generations. And now, she had found it. Then he realized something. The sky had started to darken, but it was not a normal darkness. The wind picked up, the leaves began to rustle. A humming in the distance. The sky was not gray, but purple. Sarah was startled. The lion turned and started toward the edge of the garden. Sarah went after him. It was a call. She picked up speed. She ran. When she got beyond the walnut tree, she came to a clearing. And there, the earth was cracked in a circle. In the center, a field surrounded by stones. And in the center, carved in a round stone, a symbol, a lion's head, just like on the necklace. Sarah didn't know what she was looking at, but instinctively she knelt down. At that moment, the lion came to her. It put its head down. His eyes did not close, but his breathing became heavy. Sarah touched her heart. She understood. This place was a transition, a surrender, a transfer of inheritance. And in that moment, no lightning struck from the sky, nor did a light shine. But something changed inside Sarah. Responsibility, commitment, understanding, acceptance. The lion lifted his head. He looked into Sarah's eyes. And then, he slowly backed away. He started to walk through the forest, slowly but proudly. Sarah couldn't get up. Tears ran down her cheeks. She wanted to say, "Don't go," but she didn't, because she understood. The lion had completed his mission, but there was one more thing. The task was now Sarah's. Sarah's hands were still shaking as she looked at the symbols on the ground. That lion's head carved in the stones, it was the same as the one on her necklace. She felt that everything meant something, but her mind still hadn't quite figured it out. The sky closed over them in shades of purple and gray, and the wind picked up slightly. It was neither cold nor hot, just waiting. Like a lion. Waiting, patient, but never speaking, like that silence. The lion walked to the center of the circle. He curled his huge body between the stones and put his head down. But it was not out of fatigue, it looked like a ceremony. Sarah approached slowly, keeping her eyes on him. The sound of her heart could almost be heard outside. There was a strange urge to cry, but her eyes were not yet empty. Then she remembered something her grandfather had told her when she was little. True protectors choose to be invisible, but they will find you when they need to. Maybe it was just a childish fairy tale then. But now, here, as a grown woman standing in front of a lion, it was the truth. Inside the circular space, she noticed something else. An old, mossy slab was half buried in the stones. She lifted it carefully with her hands. There were only 3 words on it. Guardia del Alma, guardian of the soul. It was written in Spanish. His grandfather had worked in South America for a while. He didn't talk much about those times. Maybe there were things he couldn't talk about. Maybe these signs, this underground room, the lion, they were all secrets hidden in her grandfather's past, waiting to be revealed to her now. Sarah's eyes lingered on the lion's eyes. There was still something there. A silent narrative. A wordless call. The lion was no longer just an animal in her eyes. It was a bearer of memory. A protector. Maybe a companion. Maybe a confidant. Suddenly the lion lifted his head. He turned his eyes to Sarah. Then he turned away from the stone circle, towards the edge of the forest. And then, he stood up. He took a few steps and then stopped. He turned his head once more towards Sarah. His eyes said, "Follow me." Sarah started to walk behind him. Her feet didn't realize where they were stepping. Everything seemed to slow down. There was only the howling of the wind, the crunching of the leaves, and her own breathing in her ears. The lion started walking into the forest. They passed through dense trees. Sarah's feet caught on branches, her pants rubbed against thorns, but she felt no pain. She was somewhere else inside her head. She was moving back and forth between the past and the present. It was as if with every step she was getting closer to that unknown answer. Somewhere deep inside, he felt that something was beginning to awaken. Something very old, but all about him. After 5 minutes of walking, the lion stopped. They had come to a small clearing. In the center was a stone structure that looked as if it had collapsed. Maybe a hut, maybe a shelter. But it didn't matter what it was. The lion stood there and looked up. When Sarah turned her eyes, she saw another figure carved on a wall opposite her. This time it didn't look like it had been drawn by a human hand. It was made with fingernail marks. Deep, jagged lines. The figure of a lion, and below it the silhouette of a human being. Side by side. Same height. On the same level. 2 beings looking at each other. Sarah froze in front of this symbol. She gasped. There, on that wall, she saw something of her own past, of her own nature. The bond between man and beast. Yes, maybe it couldn't be explained in words, but some souls could communicate without words. Just like between him and the lion. And at that moment, the first tear fell. Silently. A drop rolled down her cheek, ran down her chin, and fell to the ground. Then another. Something inside him began to dissolve. It wasn't breaking. It wasn't falling apart. On the contrary, it was coming together. It was as if a wholeness that had been fragmented for years was now being reunited by her tears. Sarah crouched down. She reached out her hand. In the rubble, she saw an old book cover. It was leather-bound, with burnt edges. She opened it. There was writing inside, but most of it had been erased. Only 1 page was readable, and it read, "The guardian is not alone. There is another soul in his shadow, and that spirit awakens when the time is right." Sarah looked up. The lion was sitting opposite her. His eyes locked with hers, as if he too had read these lines. Deep eyes, eyes that did not speak, but said everything. And in that moment, Sarah knew. Aslan was the shadow of her soul. This creature had not come into her life by chance. He wasn't just the one who found her in the forest when she disappeared all those years ago. He had watched over her. It had continued to protect her. And now he was back because something was about to begin. Maybe big, maybe quiet, but important, sacred, meaningful. When Sarah returned home that night, nothing was the same. With notebooks in her hands, the old necklace, a stone symbol in her pocket, and the look of a lion in her eyes, she lay on her bed, but she couldn't close her eyes. Even then, there was a presence waiting outside the window. He didn't know if it was physical or spiritual, but he felt it, like it was engraved somewhere in his heart. In the morning, when he went out into the garden, the lion was there again. This time he was lying on the grass, his eyes closed. Sarah sat next to him. She stroked his head with her hands. His mane was soft. Heat radiated from it. And then she asked quietly, in a whisper, "What do you want me to do?" The lion did not raise its head. He just let out a growl. Deep, soft, sincere. Sarah smiled. She understood. There was still a long way to go. The mission was just beginning. And it was not only to unravel the secrets of the past, but to protect the future. Herself, her family, her land, this bond. Because sometimes, a lion is not just an animal. Sometimes it's a mirror held up to you by a soul, and that mirror is there not to recognize you, but to remind you. Sarah was remembering herself now, and at the heart of this unforgettable animal story, she had found her soul. When Sarah woke up that morning, the sky was gray. There was silence outside the window, but it was not ordinary silence. The intensity in the air made her feel restless, as if something was about to happen. There was a pressure in his heart that he could not define. His eyes first moved to the garden. The lion was there, in the same place, lying there. But this time it was different. He didn't raise his head. His back didn't move. A shiver ran through Sarah. She hurried outside. When her feet hit the grass, the dew that had fallen during the night soaked her feet. She approached the lion. At that moment, her heart seemed to stop, because the lion was still motionless. "No," he said inside. "No, not yet." Slowly he crouched down beside her. She put her hand in his mane. At that moment he felt a stirring, a deep, slow breath. She relaxed. The lion was sleeping. But that sleep, it was deep, heavy, as if it came from within the exhaustion. Sarah's eyes filled. She stroked his head with her hands. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "I'm not ready yet." But the lion did not open his eyes. His breathing slowed. His body rose and fell in a calm rhythm. Sarah lay down next to him. She rested her head on the lion's chest. She listened to his heartbeat. And there, with her eyes full, she followed the traces of the past with gentle vibrations. She was sleeping, but it wasn't just a physical sleep. It was a kind of transition. Aslan was doing something. He was waiting. Maybe he was preparing to make a decision. At that moment, Sarah remembered a sentence from the notebook she had read in the middle of the night. "When the guardian finds you, he touches you for the last time, because he comes to leave his mission." The first time she read that sentence, she didn't understand it. But now, everything made sense. This lion had come to find him. He had protected someone. He had fulfilled a mission. And now, it was time to say goodbye. Pain rose in his throat like a lump. But this pain was not anger or panic. It was a pain of acceptance. It was a state of preparation for goodbye. At that moment, tears flowed. Silently, like a whisper that only she heard. In the heart of nature, the moment a woman cries for a lion. Perhaps it was one of the oldest emotions in the world. Loyalty, gratitude, fear of loss. The lion slowly opened his eyes. Sarah looked into his eyes. There was tiredness there, but also peace. It was as if there was a wisdom in those eyes that said, "What is meant to be is meant to be." Sarah leaned down, resting her forehead on his head. "Why did you find me?" she asked quietly. "Why now?" Her voice was trembling. His eyes were full. There was no answer. But at that moment a memory came to his mind. A story his grandfather had told him as a child. A story about a lion facing death to protect a little boy. Sarah had thought it was a fairy tale. But maybe that story was her grandfather's own past. And now this cycle had passed to her. She stood up. She unlocked the old barn at the back of the house. It had been closed for years. Inside there was dust, cobwebs, and the smell of rotten wood. But something on the wall caught his attention. A letter hidden behind a large frame. Her grandfather's name was on the letter. A small note attached to the envelope read, "The greatest family duty is carried in silence." Sarah opened the envelope. When she started to read the letter, her eyes filled with tears, because what was written there explained everything. "Dear Sarah, if you are reading this letter, he has found you. Every protector chooses someone. It was no coincidence that the lion found you as a child. He was preparing to leave me, and he chose you. I waited so long to tell you, but I couldn't find the right time. He's with you now. Maybe he has returned to hand over his mission to you. To understand her, trust your heart, not your words. For his language is silence." Sarah pressed the letter to her chest. Tears dripped on the letter. She ran back to the lion. Everything was quieter this time. The air was still. The sun's rays filtered through the clouds. Aslan was still lying there, but his eyes were open. Sarah sat down next to him. She rubbed the letter against his paw. "I know," she said. "Your mission is almost over. But I'm only just beginning." The lion bowed his head slightly. He blinked, and Sarah knew he was trying to understand. Perhaps this was the last time their eyes met. But there was also a bond in this farewell. A bond that could not be broken. A bond carried from the past to the present. A decision was forming in Sarah's heart. This wasn't just a story. This was a way of life. Her job was no longer just to be a guardian, but to protect, to pass on, to maintain that bond. That night the sky was more starry than ever. Sarah spread a blanket in front of the house. She lay down next to the lion. She rested her head on his back. Nothing was said in that moment, but everything was understood. There was an unspeakable bond between man and animal. This was not just a story of loyalty. This was a journey of souls getting to know each other. In the morning, as the sun slowly rose, a heavy silence fell on Sarah's heart. The lion had stopped breathing, but on his face, yes, I don't know how it could be on an animal's face, but there was a smile on his face. He was relaxed. He had accomplished his mission. Sarah put her head on his neck. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry, because he was with her now. In the earth, in the howling of the wind, in the silence of the night, she buried the lion in the most beautiful corner of the garden. He put his grandfather's necklace on it and left a stone next to it. He carved 3 words on the stone. Guardian of my soul. That stone was not just a monument. It was a contract, a thank you, and a beginning. Sarah was no longer alone. That night she dreamed of the lion. He was in the forest again, but this time it wasn't a child, it was her. The lion came to her. They locked eyes. The lion took a step, and then he disappeared silently. But Sarah smiled, because he wasn't gone. It had only changed form. She lived inside him now. And sometimes, life sends you a lion, not to scare you, but to remember. To remember. And one day, you'll be that lion for someone. Quiet, strong, loyal, and just in time. The days passed. The lion was no more, but his absence didn't leave a void. Every morning when Sarah went out into the garden, she felt a warmth in the direction of the wind. And at night when she looked up at the sky, she felt as if her eyes had met his. The house was quiet, but the silence was peaceful, not frightening. It was as if everything had happened at the right time, as if the mission had been accomplished. One evening, in a small room behind the old barn, Sarah wanted to open a chest her father had left behind. This chest, which had not attracted her attention before, now seemed to be looking at her strangely. When she broke open the lock, an old scroll came out. The papers were covered with symbols. They were drawings of animals, elemental signs, and familiar figures in between. On one was a giant lion. On another, Sarah drew a woman whose face resembled her own. The object she held in her hand was the same stone necklace she wore around her neck. Was this a prophecy, or a record passed down through generations? Sarah couldn't tell, but one thing was certain. Her mission was just beginning. That night she dreamed she was in a great forest. Everything was quiet. There was a smell coming from between the trees. Earth, moss, and something else. Warm breath. Sarah turned and saw the lion. But this time it was different. There were other lions with him. Their eyes were shining, but one of them was looking directly at her. Those eyes she knew. It was her lion. He approached. The lion bowed its head, and so did Sarah. And in that moment, even in a dream, she made a vow. I will be like you, she said. I will not be afraid. I will protect. I will remember. The next morning, Sarah knew what she had to do. She took the letter from her grandfather. She put the necklace around her neck. She wrapped the stone symbol in a piece of cloth and stood in the garden at the spot where the lion had buried his grave. He spread the earth with his hands and left another note underneath. It was a legacy note. Anyone who touches this vineyard is no longer alone. But then something happened. Just as he stood up, he felt something stirring under the earth. He reached his hand back. The soil was damp. There was a piece of paper on the stone where he had just left it, but he hadn't put it there. There was a familiar writing on it, like his grandfather, but not. Different. More ancient. Sarah opened the paper trembling. There were 3 sentences. The soul has passed to its guardian. Now you will be tested. The shadow still moves. A shiver ran through her. The woman waiting by the lion's grave was no longer alone. She was not only the guardian, but she would also be tested. This story did not end here. This was only the beginning. The shadows cast on the windows of the house at night now had a different meaning. Every time the wind blew, Sarah felt something approaching. But this time she wasn't afraid. She felt ready, because there was someone protecting her now, even if he was invisible. And now she would protect someone else. One evening, she found an old book left in the mailbox. The pages were yellowed. It had this title on it, The Protector's Notebook. When he opened it, he found the first sentence, only the chosen ones can pass through the silent bond. Sarah closed her eyes. She smiled. This bond was not leading to an end, but to a whole new path. A week later, Sarah started volunteering at a children's center. She started workshops on communicating with animals. She tried to teach the children to connect, to listen, to read silence. Some of the children were indifferent at first, but then Gradually, they began to rally around her, because Sarah's voice was heard not just with words, but with an echo from the heart, like a lion sneaking up on you and looking you in the eye. And one day, a boy came up to her in class. He was holding a worn notebook. "I drew this picture for you," he said. On the page was a huge lion, and next to him was Sarah. It looked like they were holding hands. That's the way kids draw sometimes. But this drawing, it was creepy. The lion's eyes, they were the same as Sarah's lost friend. And in that moment, Sarah realized everything. The bond was not over. That spirit was with her now in other ways. Maybe in another body, maybe in another child, maybe just in the wind, but it was there. The mission continued, and sometimes, even when a story seems to be over, it's the carrying of that story that matters. Sarah was carrying it now. Not just a legacy, a feeling, a voice, a look, a breath. Now I want to ask you, what would you do? If there was a huge lion waiting outside your house for days, would you open your door? Or would you just draw the curtains and watch in silence? If an animal reminded you of your past, if it touched a bond hidden in the recesses of your heart, what would you say to it? Share with us in the comments. If this story touched your heart too. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. And remember, sometimes the greatest protectors are those who are silently by our side. See you soon.